Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy. This is episode number 212. Staying cozy and close during the holidays. Welcome to today's podcast episode. Okay, so something I wanted to talk about is what happens before the holidays, because stress levels can get super high, and this kind of creates a breeding ground for some contention, some fighting, some resentment, some negative feelings towards our spouse. And a lot of times couples will complain about what happens and what takes place during the holidays. And so I love to be able to address this topic right beforehand so it's fresh on our minds and we can try to take a different approach to really creating a beautiful connection right before the holidays, right? To have some of those discussions ahead of time so that we can carry it throughout and say, yeah, look what we can accomplish if we just maybe apply 3 little tips. Okay, so let's talk about this. Usually the problems that rise during the holidays is that we get super busy. There's too much to do for the holidays, and sometimes we don't take care of some things ahead of time, and so they pile up. And during that process, we can feel distant from our spouse, like, hey, we're doing X, Y, and Z, and we look at our spouse like, hey, they're not pulling their weight or they're not doing enough. Expectations play a major role, right? We think our spouse should know what to do during the holidays. They should know what's expected of them, and they should just do it without being asked. And so when the spouse doesn't know those things and doesn't do them, man, that can really create a lot of negative feelings and emotions. This can lead to even more disappointment in our spouse and in the holidays, and can make it really hard to enjoy the time that is spent together. And this all leads to the stress going up. And if you've listened to my podcast for any amount of time, then you're probably going to recognize that when I say the stress levels becoming high is going to block the woman's desire to be intimate, right? Stress is one of the biggest blockers to a woman feeling that desire to be intimate. It blocks it. So if you find that either as a woman, your desire to be intimate is really going down and you're like, I just have zero desire. And if your husband who's noticing this and your wife, take a close look at the stress levels, okay? Especially of the wife. This doesn't seem to apply as much to men. Yes, they can get stressed, but they often want to be intimate when they're stressed out. And the opposite is true for women. It's an actual blocker. So what do we do about this? We're going to talk about a few things that we can do. And I really want you to grab onto even just one of these ideas and try to apply it. But if you can really do maybe 2 or 3 of them, you will probably have some more success. So one thing to have in the back of your mind during the holidays is to make the conscious decision to put emotional closeness, emotional intimacy kind of at the forefront. Say, you know what? Things are about to get busy. Things are about to become crazy and chaotic and stressful. But if we keep emotional closeness as the priority, then that's really going to help us make a lot of clear decisions. And when times do get stressful, like even in the moment, we will know what our priority is, and we can stay focused on it. We can have clarity on it, and we can make sure at least we're addressing that. Because if you're able to address that, then it seems like everything else will really fall into place, even if it doesn't go according to plan. So let's talk about some things we can do. We want to value this emotional closeness over proximity and distance closeness. Does that make sense? Like, it's not just about being in the same room and going to the same holiday events with your spouse. Like, we're not talking about that kind of closeness as the priority. We're actually talking about emotional closeness during the holidays, even when you're not at events, right? Even the preparation or the planning or all the things that happen before some of these events, that is also a part of it. So, we're going to focus on three things. We're going to talk about increased vulnerability, which leads to increased compassion. We're also going to talk about increased trust and deep communication. Okay, so let's talk about this increased vulnerability. Why in the world would Shelley be bringing this topic up right before the holidays? And the reason is because this time of the year can be very vulnerable. We can feel very unsure of ourselves. We can think that there's so many things that need our attention. We can become very worried. We can become very nitpicky, like focusing on the wrong things. We can fall into the trap of all or nothing thinking or extreme thinking or horribleizing our spouse. And this can leave us feeling very vulnerable, very open to all types of negative things. So we want to be aware of that and actually lean into that. We want to not shy away from everything that is going on in our mind, but actually just lean into it and be aware and say, you know what? Like, let's address these things. Let's actually dive into those things. We want to increase the vulnerability. And this is going to allow us to actually start that process of sharing what we are vulnerable about. This is very bonding. This can really allow us to feel closer to our spouse. Now, how do we do this? We're going to use the words I feel, okay? I feel nervous about this. I feel concerned about this. I feel worried about this. I feel hesitant or stressed about such and such that's coming up. Being able to say the words, I feel, and then you actually use a feeling word, right, about how you feel is such a bonding experience, and it allows you to dig a little bit deeper with your spouse and share on a deeper level. It's so natural and so human to kind of just, snap in the spur of the moment when things aren't going well. And then that usually ends up becoming something negative, a negative experience with our spouse. And so, what I'm offering and suggesting is that we make the decision ahead of time to be vulnerable and to share our emotions, to share our thoughts ahead of time, the worrisome ones. Now, as we are doing so, as we're saying, I feel nervous about this thing that's coming up. I feel worried that we're not going to get everything done. As we're doing that, we're able to create a dialogue and an opportunity to address those things. Maybe we're worried about some in-laws that are coming. And every time that Uncle Jerry comes around, man, he says some things that gets everybody really worked up. And so we have an opportunity to actually start discussing it, addressing it, and actually set some personal boundaries about how to approach it. Here's the key. If there are certain, let's say, extended family members that when you guys all get together, there are certain ones that like to stir up the drama or cause some contention, plan on it happening again. Because most people will repeat their behaviors. And unless they're in a coaching program or they're in therapy or counseling, they're probably not making any changes. That means they're going to show up the same way they have always shown up. So if you can just plan on it and say, oh, yes, that Uncle Jerry, he's going to say some things, Then you can decide with your spouse ahead of time, hey, what are we going to do when Uncle Jerry says these things? How are we going to handle it? How are we going to respond? The reason this is so powerful is that you don't have to go around trying to control Uncle Jerry or anybody else, right? If you have 20 extended family members showing up for Thanksgiving dinner, it's going to be very hard for you to control 20 people, 20 adults who have their own mindset and their own ideas, their own agency, their own way of doing things. And adults don't get to control other adults. And so the most powerful thing we can do is decide ahead of time of how we are going to be in control of ourselves when things unfold, when things go south and negative, and when Uncle Jerry continues to do the things he has done for years. This can feel so different than just standing around waiting on pins and needles saying, I hope he doesn't say those things, or trying to control Uncle Jerry by making some critical comments or condescending comments. We don't need to do any of that. We just decide ahead of time how we are going to handle the situation. Now, when you do that and you are having a discussion about this with your spouse, this can be very connecting, very bonding for each spouse and for you as a couple. Really lean into that. It can be very cathartic and therapeutic, especially going into the holidays. Now, here's something awesome that happens as a result. When you're able to look at Uncle Jerry and all the things he does and the way he stirs up drama, right? You can say, oh, poor Uncle Jerry. He still hasn't learned any skills. Like he's still lacking those skills. We were hoping this year maybe he would have learned a skill, but he hasn't. Oh, that must be rough to not have some of these skills. And as we're able to look at Uncle Jerry in that way, we now have compassion on him instead of like anger and waiting on pins and needles and being upset with Uncle Jerry. Really starting to think about him as a human with a lack of the skills that are necessary to handle his stuff with grace can really allow the brain to think about Uncle Jerry differently. And when we think about him differently as like, oh, a person who's lacking skills to solve his own problems, we are going to feel different about him. And instead of feeling angry, we're going to have this type of compassion. When we are actually able to have compassion for other people, that allows us to take action that is rooted in compassion and love instead of anger and resentment. It makes a huge difference in our actions towards other people. So if we want the holidays to go well, it would really be beneficial for us to tap into that compassion within ourselves so that we are taking action based and rooted in compassion and love instead of all the other negative emotions that we often take action from during the holidays when we're stressed. So I would love to invite all of you to think something like, oh, this person is still doing this. They're missing the skills for their own life. That type of thought can really invoke this feeling of compassion. And then as you're doing that, you're able to think of boundaries that are more beneficial and more effective than saying, well, we're just going to tell Uncle Jerry what to do. When you are feeling compassion towards Uncle Jerry and his lack of skills, you now know how to create your own boundary. Oh, okay. Well, when we see Uncle Jerry mouthing off to people, during Thanksgiving dinner, this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk to Uncle Jerry about his favorite hobbies, about fly fishing, and we're going to ask him his opinions on these different types of rods and which one he thinks is best. Right? That is a wonderful, wonderful way to create your own game plan ahead of time, your own boundary of like, hey, we're not going to overreact to Uncle Jerry. We're going to try a different approach, an approach that says we're going to talk about something different that he really likes, that he's passionate about. And we're actually going to show genuine interest in it. Even if it's not our own favorite hobby, we're going to show some genuine interest in him and his hobbies so that the whole experience, the whole holiday experience can go better, right? Because in the end, Uncle Jerry may be a pain in the butt, but he's also family, and we're probably grateful that he is a part of the family. So why not do something very loving towards him, right? By talking about something he's very passionate about. That's just one example. There's multiple ways to set your own boundaries and to be able to respond in a way that is more mature and more adult-like, that uses more intellect. And as we are able to tap into that compassion side of ourselves, our stress can stay down and we can use the higher part of our brain for better thinking. So that's what we want to do. So, what do we do about this as a couple? Well, we want to make sure we have at least one conversation. We may not need like 20 conversations about this, and that will probably feel very overwhelming. And if a wife tells her husband, like, let's have 10 conversations about expectations and about emotional intimacy, the husband might be like, I don't know about that. But if we're able to say, like, hey, I would love to have just one discussion about staying close when things get stressful, that is so much easier for the brain to like accept and respond to, like, oh, I could do one conversation. That's not going to be too much to ask for, right? And so I really want to remind husbands and wives of a goal to have. Husbands, I would love for you to keep in mind to take on the role of asking, to be a questioner, right? Don't be a mind reader, especially with your wife. Ask her questions. When it comes to the holidays, don't try to read her mind. Don't try to assume anything. Ask her so you know the reality. Hey, what are you concerned about? Hey, what are your thoughts about this? How do you feel about this? If you are able to ask your wife her thoughts about the holidays and her feelings about the holidays, you're going to be golden, right? Your wife is going to think when you ask her those questions, like, oh, he sees the real me. He really wants to connect with me. He really wants to understand me on a deeper level. And that's very exciting. That's a huge turn on. And so, husbands, do not underestimate the value and the impact, the power of asking your wife questions about what she thinks and how she feels about any topic. But since we're talking about the holidays, that one in particular. Now, for the wives, I would love for you to really consider the role of being an advocate for yourself. And what this means is like advocating for your thoughts, for your feelings. And what that would look like is going to be something like, I really think this, and then express your thoughts. I'm concerned about this. I'm worried about this. All these are I statements, okay? You're talking about how you think. I feel concerned. I feel worried. These are all I statements, right? You're not going to be talking negatively about your spouse, like you never do this, you always do this. We're not going to fall into that trap during the holidays. You're going to talk from your perspective and you're going to own it as an adult. So you really need to advocate for yourself, and not in a negative way. I'm talking about doing things ahead of time. I'm concerned about this so that you can have that discussion of how to set healthy boundaries and how to come up with plans ahead of time before things really get stressful. So that type of communication and increased compassion for yourself, for your spouse, for other family members, that is going to play a huge role in lowering the stress during the holidays. Okay. Another idea is going to be focused on communication, effective communication before the holidays and during the holidays. And I just mentioned it quickly, but here I want to focus on it. There are two types of communication skills that I would love for you to really increase in frequency, like how much you're using these starting today, right? Starting right now. And this first one is the I statement. I think, and then communicate your thoughts, and I feel, and then communicate a one word emotion. I feel nervous. I feel hesitant. I feel worried. I feel happy. I feel anxious. That type of communication is vulnerable. It's real. It's raw. It's authentic, but it also invites your spouse to ask you more questions and find out more. Why do you feel this way? What's going on for you? This is a beautiful thing. Whenever there's like a negative feeling or a negative emotion, you really want to dive into the I statements. I think this. I'm concerned about this. I feel this. Okay. So those are the two areas of I statements. I think and I feel. Now, there's another type of communication that I would also love for you to increase before the holidays and during the holidays. And these are you statements. And anytime you're going to start a sentence with the word you, there better be a compliment that comes afterwards. Usually, the trap that couples fall into, especially when there's tension or negative feelings or stress, is we start sentences with you and then we blame our spouse for something. We say something negative, rude, mean, condescending, controlling, whatever it is. We say, like, you're like this, you're always like this, you never pay attention to this, right? All these negative you statements, it completely shuts down effective communication. The other person now is not listening to anything you're saying. They're only forming their defense and their counter argument. Okay, so we don't want to do that. It's not effective communication. But in order to create real, true, effective communication, the negative stuff comes with I statements. That's how you communicate it. But on the opposite end, you use you statements to communicate the positive things that they are doing. And the more that you're able to also use these you statements with compliments, the more that your spouse is going to be able to hear the I statements and really allow it to sink in and penetrate and make an impact. So it's important to really consider both styles of these statements and to use both of them. Wow, you really showed up with the Christmas lights. And I really appreciate that. That means so much to me that you did that. You really came through. You're so consistent. You really spoke beautifully today when you were, talking to our children. Whenever you're saying you, I want you to challenge yourself to follow that up with a compliment, because then we have a natural human desire to do more of those good things that our spouse is recognizing within ourselves and our efforts. Okay, that's a real motivator when we're pointing those good things out. It's super effective and it's not that hard to do. We're not always used to doing that. We're not always used to giving those compliments. And I really want you to think about this as you're approaching the holidays. Like, this is a gift you give to your spouse. You give it to yourself because it feels good when you're giving compliments like, you are really good at this. You are showing up. You are being amazing. And how awesome to increase compliments and use this as like, this is a gift. This is a way that I can give gifts to my spouse and to others during the holidays. What an awesome gift. The gift of compliments. We know that we feel good when we receive compliments. And so why not increase that during the holidays? The other cool thing about that is, as we're looking for ways to increase compliments, our focus is now looking for the good. We're spending time looking for the good things in our spouse to be able to compliment them on, instead of just like, look what they're not doing, right? It's easy for our brain to find the negative. We have to make the decision to actually focus on the positive enough so that we can actually compliment it. So take on that challenge and try to increase your compliments towards your spouse. This is going to sink deep into the brain and go, yes, that's my person. They get me. They see me. They understand what I'm trying to do. They see my efforts. They value them. They value me. They appreciate me. They respect me. Oh, compliments are such a beautiful gift. Let's do some more of that before the holidays and during the holidays. Okay, the last part is to increase trust. Now, as you're doing these other two things, then trust can go up. And trust is so important for relationships. As you have one or two discussions about the holidays, about setting boundaries, and about how you want to handle things when they take a turn or if they take a turn, just pick one thing as like the main theme. Like, hey, if everything goes wrong, if everything takes a turn for the worst, this is how we're going to stay connected. We're going to do this one thing. It could just be that, like, hey, you give each other a sign, right? Like when you itch your ear, like that's a sign, like, hey, my stress level is through the roof and we need to connect, right? And maybe that's the signal of like, hey, I just need to have a hug from you. Or hey, that's the signal of like, we need to enact and apply the boundary that we talked about. Just come up with this one thing where if all else fails and nothing is going right, we are going to do this one thing and it's going to be meaningful that we do it. Again, something so simple. It does not have to be big. Maybe it's we're just going to hold hands for 5 minutes while things unravel or whatever it is, right? Just decide ahead of time. This one thing is going to be what makes the holidays meaningful, and have it be a way that you guys actually connect, maybe even just physically connect so that you know emotionally you are there for one another. This creates a team mindset, a unified mindset. Like we're in it together. We're working through it together. We are there for one another. We are supported. This creates a high level of trust, which is very foundational for intimacy. So I hope that you can realize that as you're thinking about these three ideas, that it really can create a higher level of emotional intimacy, which usually leads to the sexy stuff, right? The physical sexual intimacy. So this week, I hope you can take one or two or three of these ideas and really apply them before the holidays so that you're used to it. You've made your decisions ahead of time of how you're going to navigate and handle things when the holidays actually arrive. And this will allow you to feel rooted in yourself and grounded, but also with your spouse. So make sure you make those decisions this week before the holidays. Because remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you can restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you will join me again next week.